Welcome everybody, it's lovely to have you all here. I'm excited to talk about styles of education. You mentioned flipped classrooms in yours, and so I'm going to expand on that a little bit and discuss what we do here at the IGE program at Cal Poly Pomona. I'm going to start with the idea that we live interdisciplinary lives. We need interdisciplinary classrooms. That's how students learn. It's really how they've always learned, but we forgot, and colleges became these little boxes of we only study this in this room, and this in this room, and this in this room, and that's not natural. It's never been a natural way for people to learn. So I think we need to think about it in this different way. Personally, I come from a very interdisciplinary life. I was a television writer for many years, so these are some of the programs that I worked on. And when I was finished doing that, I moved into academia, started writing books, popular culture, largely things about movies and television shows and things that I had experience with. And so for me, it was interesting to blend my past with this new job of teaching. I'm also the book review editor for the Journal of Screenwriting, and I'm on the editorial board for Written By Magazine, which is a magazine of the Writers Guild of America. And so I'm doing a lot of work with people and talking about humanities and what's going on. I then came to the IGE department here at Cal Poly Pomona. And again, this is our theory. We tend to teach a lot of the engineering and architecture students because the sales point for this program is there are no tests. Everything is based on reading primary documents and writing about what you've read, and then sharing that writing and those ideas in a group. And we think that's a really important thing to teach. So what I'm going to cover today is some of the ways that we deliver information, different than a common lecture, which is what everyone's used to. So we talk about flipped classrooms. We're going to talk a little bit about Socratic circles, and people think you can't do that in a math class. Well, maybe not exactly, but there are ways to work around that. We're going to talk about relevancy, how what you're teaching is relevant to the lives of the students today, not just 10 years from now, and certainly not just for the purpose of getting a grade. That's not the only reason that a class is relevant, but they tend to think about it that way when it's given in these little pieces the way we do it. And then I'm going to talk about storytelling in class and how that helps get ideas and principles out and stuck and retained in their minds. So for me, thinking about engineers, my idea was, well, is learning a science, right? Can it be? Is there a science of learning? And there have been a lot of studies that prove that there is in many ways. And it boils down to something very simple and very easy. Effective content, content that will stay in their minds, is something that's delivered and connected to the emotions. It doesn't mean we have to cry when we're lecturing, but it means we have to give them reasons to care about this material. And we can do that with any material. It doesn't have to be poetry or movie reviews or things like that. So I think that that's something to think about. So in the flipped classroom world, what does that mean? It means that we sit in these Socratic circles, which scare people, and it shouldn't. It scares teachers as much as it scares students. They're afraid of giving their opinion in a room because what if somebody doesn't agree with them? But their entire careers will be based around sitting at conference tables, discussing ideas and brainstorming new things to do, whatever your business is. So getting used to that now's the time. I always say the quiet kid who sits in the back of the room and scores well on all the tests and get an A, they haven't gotten a real education, because if they don't open their mouth in front of a room full of people and say what they think, they're not trusting themselves or what they know, and they're not going to be able to perform well when they go out into the business world. So having this experience is an important one. We also go outside a lot. Hey, we're in a lovely campus, but also you have to change up the stimulation to children. And I think it's really interesting to experience things, take walks around a campus. We have a place where you can sit outside in Southern California most of the year. The fact that we trap ourselves in these gray rooms is really not very stimulating, right? When we have that opportunity, we have to use it. This is not stimulating. And when you're simply always, certainly there are reasons for lectures, but every single class can't be this kind of lecture, because look at that room. They look like they're engaged, but they could all be looking at Facebook. You have no idea that they're actually paying attention to you and actively participating with their minds, right? And so we need to get them out and involved. A lot of what we do, and I think we should advocate, always are group projects, reasons for people to work together to solve a problem and then explain to the group how we solve that. They learn more through that process, as we know. That's our theory here, learn by doing. But these kids are certainly not looking at Facebook right now. This class time, they don't need to have information given to them. They can get the information home through textbooks, through videos, through anything else we provide, and then come and talk about how they feel about that information. How did they retain it? What did they think is interesting about it? How is that helping them? right? So having to present, having to become experts in some area, and then present that information to a room makes you a better learner because you've had to learn it as a teacher first. I was a high school teacher after my first degree, and I was teaching American literature, and I couldn't believe I got into a textbook that this school gave me. They had poets I'd never heard of. And I thought to myself, this is crazy. I have a degree in this and I've never heard of them. I now had to learn more in order to be able to answer the questions in the room. So I think that having the experience of teaching it to the classroom is excellent for students. Anytime a student is allowed to present, they're forcing themselves to be better. And of course, if they fail at it, they fail in the class. And they learn from that and they have to come back and do it again. So I think that experience is something that's well worth doing. Of course, we have hands-on things, just as most of your classes do in engineering. This happens to be a quilt that we have students make when we're studying the Underground Railroad, because the Underground Railroad, one of the ways that women who had no political power could help was if you wanted to tell runaway slaves that your home was a safe space, you would create quilts with pictures that were of things that represented freedom, boats and trains and things like that. And if that quilt was hanging outside your house, a runaway slave would know that you were a safe door to knock on and you wouldn't turn them in. All right? So just having kids then have to create their own quilt in a class, they're never going to forget that story of the Underground Railroad. And that's an important story for them to take into their study of slavery and its effect on the American population. Even when you're doing a lecture, you can start with a little hands-on thing that will stick ideas in their brains. This is a piece that we do always when we're discussing Kuhn's terms. We have them sort buttons, and we don't tell them how or why. But they begin the class sorting buttons. And when they're done, we ask them what they discovered along the way, how they chose to do it, what categories did they advance, and then we go over things like what's a paradigm, what's an anomaly. Now you see in your own work what were the paradigms, what were the anomalies in your buttons and such. It's so funny, but it makes them remember it. And across a semester, we can talk about the button sorting day, and it always goes back to those. It sticks the words in their mind because they had a fun experience learning those words. Of course, you guys all do robotics and things like that. These are all just examples of ways to get them actively involved in their education. I like to tell students a story I read several years ago. Engineering companies were getting tired of hiring children who had A's but had done no interesting experience on their campus. They were so busy studying. But they could not answer new questions because they weren't questions they'd memorized in their books. So they began to interview and ask in the interviews boys, sadly mostly boys, with B averages who could explain some Legos they had built that weren't based on the manual. How did you use a Lego kit to create something that didn't match the manual? And those are the people they hired, and those are the employees that stuck because they had used learning in a different way. And I think we have to remember that. The kids who get B's always like to hear that story. But it's a reminder that actively being involved is what counts. Now, we also know and have to think about the different learning styles, right? These are things that people talk about in elementary and high school and we forget in college. But it's not like they've changed. Children may have learned how to study by listening to a lecture, but it's still good if we can change it up and give them more experiences. People are visual, people are kinesthetic, people are auditory. And yes, even when you're doing things like this, I thought, how do I get a picture of ears? There are lots of pictures of ears, but if I have a moment in my day, I'd like to look at Orlando Bloom. That would make me happy, right? Because we can't forget the importance of humor when presenting material. Humor is something people remember. It's why we hear jokes and we like stand-up comedians. So I think it's something we should always think about. Humor equals the emotion of joy. And joy will make them remember that information. And now that I've put Tom Lehrer on the screen, you know what you're thinking of. And if you're not playing that in class when you teach them, you're like, oh, that's like perfect. That's how people remember things. Because teaching is a performance, and that's something we forget, right? That's something they don't always teach us in our PhD programs. And performance and science are make teaching an art form. It's something that we're doing above and beyond delivering information. And that's something that we don't learn about in PhD programs. I tell students and other people, I'm not a teacher anymore, I'm a curator. I curate a set of experiences that students will have, and from those experiences, they will retain the information that I have seemed to have accidentally given them. And it tends to work. Again, because this, nobody remembers. There's nothing memorable about those moments. They can't think about where they were in a special way because they're always in the same place, and it's always boring. Now, we have to think a lot about there is a science to learning and what works, right? We know that Ebbinghaus has a forgetting curve theory, that literally you get the information and it disappears so quickly unless you use it immediately, unless you put something in with that information. So the informal learning curve talks about pull information. If you had to find the information yourself in order to finish a product, you will remember that information because you had an active time gathering it. It's not the same as if I dump it in your head. There's too much that's being dumped in their heads these days. So I think that's really interesting. The difference between these two things are pretty obvious. That's what I'm talking about. We don't want isolated learners. Nobody learns well. We're a social being. We need to be in a social world. This is why I mentioned briefly this concept of the little videos online, micro-learning. Let me just get this one piece, and then the next piece, and the next piece, and I can build on those pieces. I'm going to retain that better than a giant dump of information for 2 hours in a classroom, and then I'm supposed to come back and remember it for a test or a quiz next week. It doesn't work the way we think. Many of these ideas are ideas that Maria Montessori put together in Italy over 100 years ago. She's the only person in the world I know of on money. We have no women on money in America, right? But these ideas of education have been used internationally. They're nothing new, but we forget about them when it comes to college teaching. A new thing in college teaching is the gamification theory. And that is particularly interesting to the students that we have these days, right? They are certainly often all gamers of some kind. And in the beginning, we didn't like that. We thought that it was a distraction. But it is a style of learning. They certainly learn all the rules of these games very quickly because they have to put what they learn to use immediately, right? And I think that's interesting. So there's a lot of discussion about how to game classes, how to create gaming experiences out of the learning, and that's how they'll retain it. And it's not a new thing either because Monopoly, you may or may not know, was invented to teach people the problem with capitalism. But it became, I want to be the banker so I can steal the money and win the game, which is kind of teaching you the problem with capitalism in the long run. So gamification has been around. Here at Cal Poly, we're happy that we actually have an esports team, right? So we have a competing game group. They just came in 4th in the nation for a Heroes of the Storm. So clearly, there's an excitement about that. And so why not bring that excitement into the classrooms? I think that's really important. And for me, the relevancy of what you're learning. Why is this important to you right now? Who doesn't like Socrates, right? We're not teaching. We're forcing them to learn. They're thinking they're through problems. And it's wonderful when you get a moment like that and you realize, oh my gosh, it worked. They're putting it together themselves. One of those came when I was teaching about the Japanese internment here in California during World War II. I was having this conversation and I was dumping information that involved one of the ways to get out of the camps was if you were a young man of military age, you could join the American military. And a boy in the back of the room who hadn't spoken very much ever and didn't look like he was going to do really well on the test, and in fact had not done very well, raised his hand and he said, wait a minute, if the government said that all people of Japanese descent were spies and they had to be put in camps, why would you let a spy into the military? Wouldn't that prove they don't believe they're spies? And I just, yes, thank you. You just thought your way through that. I didn't have to tell you that. You came to that conclusion by putting these things together. That was, to me, a beautiful learning moment, right? Similarly, I was discussing the American Revolution a while back, and a student finally realized that George Washington is a hero to us, but in England, he's a man who committed treason against his king. And he was like, but how can he be a hero if he committed treason? It's all about perspective in history. It's all about perspective. And that was the lesson he learned that day. He might not remember the Battle of Bunker Hill and exactly who was in charge at Yorktown, but he's going to remember that history is told through different perspectives, and you have to hear as many sides as possible. And that was the lesson, not the details of some battle. That doesn't help you. All right, so making it real. Ken Robinson has this marvelous TED Talk where he talks about bringing our creativity back into our teaching, and that we should be allowed to do that. We don't have to be staid, boring people who stand around podiums and just speak off books all day long. For me, some of the things we can do, which we forget, again, we forget in a college classroom, but they're very, very valuable. In the beginning, we shouldn't just read a syllabus because we want them to know when things are due and what days the tests are on. You should read a syllabus and ask them questions about why they think this class is necessary. What do they hope to gain from being in this classroom? They have to think about why they're here, not just because somebody they don't know put it on a list of classes they must take. This does not help them gain knowledge. They don't understand the relevancy of it to their life. So we have to do that, and we have to check in at various points throughout the semester. Hey, where are we at with this? Are we feeling more useful? Are we getting some? What else do we need to get right now, right? We have to remind them that the value of the class, or they're going to forget it in their rush to just get an A, which is not the value of the class. The value of the class is retaining the information. One of the things I like is the idea of retrospective post-assessments, which is one of those fancy words that just means an exit interview. But we should make time. So if you're in a class where you can't Socratically discuss whether 2 + 2 = 4, of course not. But you can discuss, what have you gained from this class? What do you think you still need to know before you move on to the next level of your education, before you move into the professional world? We can have them discuss those things so they can put it together for themselves. And that's a valuable ending class, more than a study session before the final. They can do that themselves with a group of friends, right? So we have to think about making them think about their education. I think that makes it stronger. I mentioned humor, right? Because for those exit interviews, we bring food. Food is good. Gifts are good. Little tiny things. The gamification of a class. If you open your mouth, you get a donut. If you don't, you don't, right? So humor is always a useful thing. For me, relevance is very big. Even in any class, I try to bring in newspaper articles that are about the things that we're studying, right? So in a class, the class that Dr. Zhao was nice enough to come to is about technology and history and how technology has changed our history in America particularly. And so, my goodness, there was much discussion a few years ago about the issues with concussions. I thought that was very important in a school that doesn't have a football team. It was lovely to remind them that it's good not to have a football team and that this is something we should pay attention to. And also, because the movie had come out, it was amazing to have them watch that movie as homework and see how much trouble, even though a man, Dr. Bennett Omalu, could prove that something was going on, there were other issues that weren't allowing that information to come to light. And how do we deal with that? You could be a scientist who proves something very important, but if somebody squashes that information, how do you get around that? What do you need to learn in order to make sure that this information is disseminated so mothers of high school kids don't let their kids play football anymore because it's not useful? All right, and obviously we discuss climate change a lot. That's something that they can connect to their own lives. It's not just some facts I'm giving you to put on a test. How do you discuss this? How does it affect your own life? I think that's really important. I have them listen to podcasts, right, outside of class, and then write up their impressions of what came. That's important to them. I want them to develop the habit of gathering information in their real life when they're out of my classroom. That's part of what I'm teaching them, so I have to build a habit, even if I make it a requirement. We know that students, particularly millennials, are very involved in ethics in the world. So we want to think about the ethical questions of what we're talking about. If it's engineering and you're designing something, how's that going to affect people here or there? There's a lot of talk about the Mountain Lion Bridge that they want to build for $60 million. And that's a wonderful way to get mountain lions diverse here in Southern California, but we have how many homeless people we're not taking care of. So is that a good use of our money or not? And what do we, that's an interesting discussion for students. They have to make these choices when they leave school. So it's good to hear them debate them and hear other perspectives. And I know this sounds a lot like Kumbaya, and we're all dancing and happy and having a good time, but they're thinking while we're having a good time, basically. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about storytelling and how storytelling keeps ideas in your head longer. And the fact is you can tell the stories in class, you can show a movie if you want. I don't believe in wasting class time for that because I want it to be discussion, but that's what homework's for. Right? People can watch a lot of things at home and retain ideas. Elena Ferrante wrote these wonderful Neapolitan novels, which are about two girls in Italy at the end of World War II. I love these books. Aren't they great? And it's all about education and how it changed these two women's lives. But I particularly appreciated her quote when she thinks about education. The ideas that I memorized in order to shine have all faded, right? Not only do I have nothing left in my head, I have the impression I studied very hard without learning. It was all an act, but no real learning took place. And that really struck me. She remembered best elementary school because the proud wonder of gaining a new skill you could actually use. That's what they should feel out of any class, because that's going to build their education. And I think that's really cool. So stories do what I said in the beginning. Stories plus information create the memorability. Now I remember that because I have a story to go with that fact. And everything has a story built around it. Very briefly, Dr. Neil Baer, he got a job as a consultant on the show ER to give them the doctor slang. And then in studies he read that more people in America learn about medical discoveries from fictional television programs than they do from watching the news or reading the newspaper. So he ended up becoming a TV writer, figuring that he would have influence over more people by telling these fictional stories, one of which he'd read that many Americans who couldn't afford their prescriptions, elderly people, were sharing prescriptions. We'll buy it, and I'll take it Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and you'll take it Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, right? And then they would show up at ERs sick because they weren't getting the proper dosage, and they wouldn't want to admit that it was because they were poor. So he wrote an episode about that and got more people talking about that problem than had he given lecture after lecture after lecture. So connecting it to a story is very important. We like to use Temple Grandin because there's a lot of interesting information both about her autism and how that was treated in the world, and her work in stockyards with animals, and I think that's really interesting. Of course, Hidden Figures came out a couple years ago. Excellent way to talk about the value of math, the importance of math, talk about the space program, talk about minorities in STEM education. I think that's really big. I like to show Debbie Sterling's TED Talk. She created Goldie Blocks because she found not enough girls involved in engineering and realized it was from childhood. We don't play in that way. We play with dolls, which is useless. So she's a great one, always catches the female engineers really deeply. And of course, there are TV shows, the Lovely Genius Show. You want to learn more about Albert Einstein, it's a great thing. We do a lot with Hedy Lamarr because new stories and the ideas of your cell phone wouldn't work, relevance to their life. You wouldn't have it without this lady who you've never heard of. And if you heard of her, it's because she was pretty and she was in movies. But in fact, she was also pretty and a scientist. What a crazy idea. You can be both. There was a documentary that came out about her last year, so that's worthwhile. And here's my side note. If you look at all these slides that have flown by so quickly, inclusion and diversity are very important in education. But you can't just give a lecture about it. You have to think when you're putting together a slide deck, how many people of color could I get in pictures in this? How many women could I get to show you? Just accidentally. So they're part of the story, and it's not the one day we discover women scientists. They're always in the story, right? So I just think that's really important. Show, don't tell. Because we're trying to get more women involved in STEM. That's the goal, right? I like STEM, but I have to admit, I'm only here today because I'm STEAM. I'm the art part of the whole thing, right? But that is also the story part, and that's the part that makes it real to us. So I think it's really important to remember adding in the artistic, the creative part of people's lives into any classroom. Because we're interdisciplinary people, we have to have interdisciplinary learning. I think that something you can recommend in any class, even if it's a math class, is to keep a journal about things you're reading about, things that you're learning, things in the news that are about what you're learning. Keep a journal, and what I think is really interesting is make them keep one by hand, because there's a lot of studies about how important it is to continue the act of handwriting and how that brings ideas into your mind because you can remember where it was visually on a page. They may not do it in your classroom taking notes, it's too hard, they want to type on their laptop, that's fine. But to do some work that involves hand-eye coordination is very good for retention. I think that's really cool. Obviously current events sounds very high school, but they should be keeping an archive of articles that affect their future business. Are you a civil engineer? Are you a mechanical engineer? What's going on? What buildings have fallen down? What's happened in this place or that place? And here's my trick. When I talk about this, people start thinking, oh, that's a lot of extra homework I have to grade. And here's the top secret part, which I probably won't allow when I print the video on you don't have to read any of it. The act of them writing it down themselves is all that was necessary. You just have to collect the book, see that they've got 10 pages, and hand it back. Bam, 10 points, you're good. It's their writing. It's their memory. You don't need to read every word. You're not an English teacher, right? But them doing it is what you want to encourage. So when they leave your class, they'll continue to collect this information. So that's my trick. I go back to that slide all the time because what we're trying to do is become people that are memorable. Because if they remember us, they remember what we've taught them. And they remember the stories we've told, and they tell them to other people. That's the job of teaching. That's why I was really impressed with Jawa's TED Talk, which you should all watch, because it was about teaching. I didn't expect an engineer to do a speech on teaching. So that was really interesting to me. And again, because I say from the very beginning, there is a science to learning. There's lots of books about it. They hand us lots of stuff to try to help us be better teachers. We tend to ignore it. Oh, I went too fast. I want to go back to, oh, I didn't. I skipped one. One got out of there. Oh, well. I had one slide that was a picture of a bunch of little PhD people in caps and a list of all the classes I took for my PhD, none of which were about engineering. Excuse me, of course not, I'm a historian. None of which was about teaching. And I was shocked. I had been a high school teacher. When I got a PhD, nobody taught a class in how to teach. And that scared me because I met people who were far smarter than I was and I thought were brilliant. But I knew that the minute they walked in front of a room of 20-year-olds, they would fall apart. And the kids would learn nothing from them. Because teaching itself is a science and is a talent that has to be treated and taught and practiced. And that's my point.